Some clocks don't tick in seconds, they tick in centuries. In the spring of 2001, a van rattled up a rutted lane outside Bézieux, France. The chapel at the end of that lane wore a roof like a tired shoulder, its bell tower empty, its walls furred with moss. Inside smelled of damp limestone and old beeswax, prayers after scent. Sunlight slid through a slit window and drew a pale blade across the nave. Dust hung suspended, like time thinking. A parish contact said the mission was simple: reinforcement, preservation, keep tourists from leaning on the altar. But among the conservators walked a man who shouldn't have been there, Dr. Hervé Langla, symbologist from Marseille, a patient hunter of patterns most people never see. He started with edges, where plaster kissed stone, where paint flaked to first intention. The right side of the altar wall rang wrong beneath his knuckle, halfway between solid and hollow, as if the wall had forgotten its job. The mortar looked too clean for a medieval build. He marked a rectangle the size of a book and waited for night. 2 nights, 47 careful taps. The wall ceased being a wall and became a door pretending to be one. Beyond, bedrock shaved into an alcove exhaled cold, dry air, the kind that has never met a summer. On 2 stone ribs lay a lead-lined box, seams sweating grey, silk wrapping that should have turned to dust long ago. A conservator with steady hands teased the lid free. Inside, a disc the size of a dinner plate, metal like stormlight pressed flat, colder than gloved fingers expected. At its heart, a 6-armed cross, one arm deliberately broken, the wound smoothed. Around it, rings of microscopic glyphs, planetary sigils made familiar and strange, ticks so fine they seemed painted until torchlight caught the incision and made it whisper. Langla leaned close. He didn't touch, he watched his breath fog over the metal and vanish as if the disc disliked being seen. Near the center, a shallow cup, too precise for damage, a focal node, a place where light, or something like it, might be caught, and asked a question. They cleared a table, spread linen, set the disc down like a patient. Langla photographed, traced, measured. He smiled the quiet smile of someone who has chased a rumor for years and finally hears the rumor breathe. Virgo, he murmured. Not because the sign sat there, but because every other sign seemed to lean away from it. He mapped 3 rings, glyphs over ticks, over an invisible lattice, then laid them atop 2 medieval sky tables and 1 modern orbital simulation battered into his old laptop. The result was not a word. It was a date. He checked it, refused it, checked again by a different path. The numbers held like stone. August 4th, 2039. By dawn, the parish keys jingled again. By noon, a polite man in a tidy coat, heritage liaison, lamination conferring holiness, arrived and smiled the smile of someone who already knew the answer to the question he hadn't asked. That afternoon, the chapel was taped. The next morning, the box was gone. Not the disc, the context. Objects, like people, sometimes keep their own counsel. Langla photographed everything one last time. He boxed the date on his page with a pencil that nearly broke through. Then he left Bézieux with a battered folder and a silence that rearranged him. In Corsica, a monastery door opened as if the monk already knew his name. "You've brought something heavy," the monk said, looking not at the bag, but at the air around Langla's shoulders. "Yes," Langla said. "Good," the monk replied. "Then leave it outside." The Templars, he would later write, did not bury treasure. They buried instructions. and one of those instructions had started to tick again. The story most people know about the Knights Templar is the one the victors allowed to survive. Warrior monks, protectors of pilgrims, bankers to kings. True, but only the uniform they wore when the world was looking. When the world wasn't looking, they were couriers of ideas. From 1119 to their dissolution in 1312, they stitched a network across Christendom that could move more than coin and supplicants. In ports from Acre to Marseille, manifests list salt, spice, and instrumentum ad stellas, instruments for the stars, line-itemed in cramped script, and spared all taxes. A Dominican scribe in Catalonia noted a quarrel over a rooftop during a lunar conjunction. It ended when a Templar seal trumped a royal astrologer's pride. They rode not only with swords, but with translators. In Damascus and Cairo, knights sat under Sufi gardens and copied Persian star tables by lamplight. In Toledo's schools, they traded Euclidean proofs for lunar mansions in the Arabic sky. In their wake, marginal drawings that do not belong to a monk's hand, star paths in Idrisi's style overlaid on Latin codices, tiny six-pointed crosses with one point darkened, squeezed into margins as if the scribe feared giving them a full line. Langler had traced a cartographic habit. Templar preceptories often cited to older stones, dolmens, barrows, circles that remembered solstice. Temple Brewer aligned with midsummer sunrise over a Bronze Age mound. In Tomar, the round church's windows framed Sirius once every 19 years. Coincidence is a polite word for patterns that make us uncomfortable. They were not court astrologers, they were navigators of a deeper kind, mapping cycles that outlived kings. In the archives of Aragon, a ciphered letter speaks of a circle without circumference to be guarded till the time appointed by the sixth light. Historians called it allegory. Langler, years later, remembered it the way a buried seed remembers rain. The Idrisi disc of 1154, silver engraved with the world, was presented in Sicily. Records show Franks in white in attendance. The silver vanished within a generation. Fragments of coastline in his unmistakable hand survive, but on sheets overlaid not with trade winds, with star paths. This was the hidden face of the Templars, archivists of patterns too vast for one lifetime. An army? Yes, but more, a courier net for dangerous cargo, knowledge, and once you know that, a broken-armed cross in a silent French chapel stops being an oddity. It becomes a message left on a windowsill 7 centuries ago, addressed to a reader who hadn't been born yet. The seal of the sixth light. Langler found the name in half a dozen footnotes that behaved like guilty secrets, always in margins, always coded. First glance, a 6-armed axis, not a Christian cruciform, but a geometry with intentions. One arm cut away and smoothed, a designed wound. The center cupped like a sundial's heart. 3 rings, glyphs that felt stitched from 3 alphabets, a scale of ticks with every 7th slightly longer, and every 52nd a hairline notch. An outer web of incisions connecting the inner like spider silk. He counted the ticks, divided the longer marks, and the number appeared with the inevitability of gravity, 729. 9 cubed, completion multiplied by itself. In Kabbalistic arithmetic, the restoration after fracture. In cathedral music, the overtone that makes stone breathe. He overlaid the web on the night of October 1307, the week of arrests, and watched the incisions align with 6 celestial moments visible from Paris, conjunctions, eclipses. The missing arm pointed not to a star at all, but to Al-Faragh, the void, an interstice between constellations Arab astronomers once named, and which modern radio telescopes would much later notice as a cold spot in the oldest light. Langler traced spiral overcuts, places where the engraver had passed twice. The spiral began at the broken arm and ended in the central cup. The asymmetry wasn't damage, it was a key, a reference mark against which the whole geometry could be oriented to the living sky. Set the disk beneath the right heavens and the cup would sit under exactly where influence entered, not a symbol, an instrument, a clock, not of hours, but of epochs. And the final mark, when laid against modern simulations and medieval tables, all paths led, again, to August 4th, 2039. The disk's precision made sure only the disk itself could reveal it. The question that troubled Langler wasn't what would happen when that clock struck. It was why someone had wanted a stranger in the future to know the moment at all. 3 weeks after decoding the date, an unmarked envelope lay on Langler's floor. Inside, a brittle vellum fragment wrapped in wax paper, 3 concentric rings, a central cross, but this time no broken arm. The outer ticks matched Bezout's pattern. The inner ring bore not glyphs, but musical notation. No note, no provenance, only the geometry. Sister Clémence in Avignon, a Benedictine archivist, with strong coffee and stronger memory, untied a red ribbon and frowned when she saw it. "You're late," she said. This was the 3rd fragment in 20 years. One had surfaced in Italy, one in Poland, one in Spain. Owners couldn't explain acquisition, all traced by whisper to families whose ancestors had served the Templars, not as knights, but as masons, shipwrights, scribes, not leaders, memory. After 1307, the order hadn't vanished. It dissolved into trades, into bloodlines. A mason in Lisbon, a parchment maker in Krakow, a Shetland fisherman, each carrying a bead on a thread none of them could see entire. Clémence called them what they were, the custodians. They guarded time, not treasure. Langler charted appearances, 16th century Gdansk, a bronze plate bearing a starless sky, traded for barrels of herring. Valencia, 1754, 1 brass plate with circles and crosses, logged then erased by an officer whose family worked the stone at Tomar. A ledger in Rennes-le-Château, 1891, plate with broken cruciform sold to Monsieur Saunière, unusual resonance when struck. Locations were messy until he overlaid medieval shipping routes and the Gulf Stream. Then a shape emerged, a spiral like the spiral engraved on Bezout, turning toward a point in the mid-Atlantic. One question grew teeth. If multiple disks existed, what happens when they are brought together? Clémence's face grew untellable. It will not be the first time. Not the first time. Somewhere between the late 15th century and 1938 Florence, the spiral had closed, the ring assembled. No cities burned, no kings fell. And yet, small things had not survived the morning after. Sister Clémence led Langler into the underground stacks where the air carried dust like a sacrament. A folder tied with red ribbon. Inside, photographs across a century, sepia faces wearing the same lapel pin, a 6-pointed star with 1 point shaded black. A portly man on a steamship, 1899. A nurse with alert eyes, 1942. A modern collector in Madrid, 2007. The same man who'd outbid Langler for astronomical tables. They call themselves Custodes Lucis Sextae, she said. Watchers of the Sixth Light. Florence, 1938. A circular table, 12 chairs, an engraved spiral inlaid with silver. The same spiral as Bezu's. 2 gatherings proven, late 1400s, 1938. Both times something shifted, not catastrophic, subtle, maps redrawn, a name forgotten, a forest path present on Tuesday, absent on Wednesday. They are not Templars, Clemence said, not exactly. Some lineage overlaps, but they answer to no Grand Master. They watch the custodians, the fragments, the people who get too close. In Marseille, Langlard began to see shadows with faces, a man reading a newspaper who never turned a page. A car parked across the street with 2 unmoving silhouettes. In a shop window, a reflection showed a 3rd figure behind him when the sidewalk was empty. He left pencil traps, he photographed shelf order before lunch and after. The marks always moved. One morning, an envelope inside his mailbox, a black and white photograph of himself holding the broken cross at Bezu. On the back, in precise hand, "You're not the only one counting. Enemy? Ally." The line blurred. If 12 discs made one resonance, perhaps the watcher's long, quiet vigil wasn't malice. Perhaps it was the only reason the world still resembled itself. How had medieval hands calculated 2039? Cathedrals as instruments, 9-second echoes tuned to pure tones, vaults acting as standing wave chambers, clear story windows slicing sunlight like sundial spears. In Tomar, Toledo, Roslin, a monk's sustained note could make stone inhale. Place the disc where the sound focused. Strike the tone that the space craved. Islamic star tables. In Damascus, Cairo, Samarkand, scholars refined Ptolemy for centuries, tracking conjunctions, eclipses, precession. Templar translators carried those tables home under white mantles, copying them in Andalusian hands that matched the Bezu ticks. The void, al-Faragh al-Akbar, the great emptiness, used as a fixed point, a celestial zero. Modern cosmology would label a cold spot in the background's oldest light. Medieval sky readers had found a metaphor first. Overlay all layers, cathedral acoustics, imported tables, the disc as broken asymmetry, keyed to the living firmament. Start at October 1307 when arrests began, orient to Sirius at dawn, count forward not in years, but synodic months, moon to moon against a star. The ticks marched without mercy to the same date, August 4th, 2039. Not a vision, a computation, an appointment bound by physics. What was the appointment for? The disc refused to say. The most dangerous things in history often do. But Langlard had already begun to suspect. The discs were not only calendars, they might be keys. And keys, when turned together, do not merely announce a time. They open something. You can feel the story pulling tighter now, the way a string hums before it breaks. The watchers are no longer rumors, the custodians are no longer names in a ledger. Langlard stands between them, caught in a rope woven 7 centuries long, drawn toward a date that will not move for any man. This is where Act 1 closes its fist. Because once you admit the discs are instruments, once you suspect the ring becomes a machine, the next step is inevitable. You have to hear what it plays. The first clue that the disc wanted to be heard rather than merely seen arrived as a smudge in a photograph. Nothing more. Langlard zoomed in on the high-resolution shot until the metal became a landscape. What looked like dust resolved into a tiny triangle etched between 2 outer ticks. He measured the gaps not in angles but in distance, long to short, short to long. then wrote the ratio, blinked, and wrote it again. 81. 9 squared. The number that had haunted the disc's geometry since Besu. On impulse, he mapped the spacing to frequency. Numbers turned to vibrations per second, and the answer slid into place with unnerving calm. 729, 9 cubed, restoration, in Hermetic numerology, the overtone that makes vaulted air quiver. The disc wasn't just a star map, it was a score. Cathedrals had been tuned to such notes, stone lungs breathing on command. In Chartres, a single sustained voice could set candles shivering. In Tomar, the round church carried whispers 40 meters without fraying. In those spaces, a tone was not a sound, it was a tool. If 729 was encoded in the disc's bones, the object wasn't meant to be admired in silence. It was meant to be played, struck, bowed, sung into, until the metal and the room agreed on a single, unwavering pitch. Langler cross-referenced the vellum fragment Sister Clémence had shown him, the one littered with musical notation, and overlaid it with the disc's tick pattern, the intervals aligned like teeth on a key. Tuning, not ornament. He hunted deeper and found a Soviet-era physics paper that should have meant nothing, a footnote on entrainment states induced by narrowband tones between 720 and 730 Hertz. Volunteers became alert yet dreamlike, memory retrieval oddly heightened. The researchers called the state impractical for field use. Langler underlined that phrase and wrote in the margin, "Unless the field is a church." If 729 Hertz could pull minds into that liminal focus together, 12 discs, 12 rooms, one sky, then whatever the seal unlocked might not be a door in the world, it might be a door in us. It was inelegant science, but it was his. A flea market dinner plate weighted beneath to mimic the Besu asymmetry, tick marks inked along the rim. When Langler struck it gently, the tone bloomed and lingered longer than it should have. He pressed his palm above the surface without touching. The air hummed against his skin. He moved the plate to a thinner table. Struck again. The vibration ran not just through metal, but into wood, into the apartment itself, as if the room had been quietly waiting to be asked to sing. Standing waves, a resonance that refused to decay. He sketched the disc's spiral, the overcuts he'd traced under a loop, and recognized a modern idea hidden in medieval lines, a waveguide, not decoration, a groove that corrals energy, feeds it back, sustains it, a capacitor for sound. Capacitors discharge. He imagined 12 such capacitors arranged in a ring, each tuned to a neighboring harmonic, each fed by its room's architecture, until the air thickened with tension. Strike them in the right sequence, and the waves would lock into a single pulse that didn't fade. It collected. Wait for the sky to lean in, the 2039 triple conjunction, the tiny shift in the speed of sound under altered magnetism, and release everything at once. A trigger, a firing. He found a margin note in a 1902 oscillation manual, written in careful French, hand beside a sketch of the spiral. Capacité 12, décharge simultanée requise. Capacity 12, simultaneous discharge required. History had left small fingerprints where such discharges might have rippled. In 1472, sailors near the Azores described air trembling like a bell. In 1939, Madeira fishermen swore the Atlantic lay flat as glass for half a day in wind. both close to the gathering Sister Clémence had shown him. The world had not ended, it had shifted. Not a prophecy then, a machine, not a warning but a switch. The truth he didn't want. The discs might not alter the outside first. They might edit the inside. The rememberer. Langler returned to the before and afters. Antillia, an island chain drawn confidently on Venetian maps, gone a few years later without remark. A French archaeologist written up in multiple papers in 1937, scrubbed from registries by 1939 as if he had never been born. A Pyrenees village that lost its surnames after the Florence gathering, a 15th century architectural flourish that appears in no records before it suddenly appears everywhere afterward. Call it correction, call it control, call it mercy even, but it wasn't accidental. The Watcher's motto, Custodes Lucis Sextae, Guardians of the Sixth Light, took on a sharper edge. In medieval cosmology, the lunar sphere was the last mutable heaven, the realm of change and reflection before the fixed stars. To guard the sixth light might mean nothing less than managing how change enters the human world. Range, scope, limits. He wrote the questions cleanly because the cleaner the question, the less likely it is to hide from you. Does the effect touch only those present or everyone? Can the discharge insert as well as erase? Does the 2039 alignment widen the window beyond anything recorded? The last question hummed in his teeth. If the window widened, 2039 wouldn't be a maintenance cycle. It would be a rewrite. The abandoned telegraph station near Lyon held the answer, or one of them. Blindfolded in, polite, not violent, Langler sat at a long table opposite three figures. Each wore the star pin with one point blacked out. Two wore the black point up. One wore it down. The man with the up pin spoke first. His voice had the confident neutrality of someone convinced that virtue and necessity were synonyms. "We are continuance," he said. "We preserve the true course." They believed the discs were made to repair drift, nudge timelines back from greedy detours, avert disasters before they took root. They showed Langler dossiers labeled like bland administrative files, 1821, an assassination averted with a minor removal. 1920s, a premature technology suppressed to prevent economic collapse. Antillia deleted to stop a colonial war centuries early. Mercy, they called it, course correction. The woman with the down pin waited for the silence to settle. Then, "We are severance." Her voice carried a steadiness Langler trusted before he wanted to. They believed the first discharge was an ancient mistake that could not be undone, and that every subsequent correction frayed the rope. Their dossiers made different claims. 1938, a Pyrenean village forgot its names. Late 1400s, an architectural style appears out of nowhere, as if imported from a missing place. Genealogies, whole branches fade without cause. "You don't correct," she said quietly. "You amputate. And one day you cut what keeps you standing." Continuance wanted Langler to help them find the missing pieces. Severance wanted him to help them break the chain for good. No threats, no promises. Only a clock neither faction could slow. They let him go without choosing, an unkindness disguised as courtesy. On the street the rain had washed Lyon clean. For one step, for the distance between two street lamps, Langler felt the strange vertigo that arrives when you realize indecision is itself a decision. Do nothing and someone wins by default. And the world you wake into on August 5th will not perfectly match the one you fell asleep in. He chose a map instead. 3 nights later, a night train for Lisbon, a second-class seat, and a 14th century manifest in his lap. 12 Eni tabulae, sigillo militis signati. 12 bronze tablets marked with the knight's seal, destination Tavira. By dawn, the Algarve was a watercolour, the smell of salt and citrus, cobbles bright with dew. Archives yielded ash-smudged clues but no disc. It took 3 days and the cellar of a chapel with flaked blue azulejos to find the wrong tile, the only plain terracotta square among patterns. It rang off underfoot. Beneath, a shallow cavity, a scrap of oilcloth around a carved cedar baton, bearings and distances in Portolan style. The trail ran to sea, across the strait, down the Moroccan coast, and inland to a sunburst carved small but sure. The baton had waited centuries. A custodian had paid a mason to hide it 2 hands' depth beneath a priest's feet. 1 disc was never meant to return, the severance leader had said. 2 weeks later, the anti-Atlas wind combed the Wadi's stones, while Langla eased himself sideways through a fissure. Inside, the heat fell away. A chamber, soot-dark walls, limestone pedestal, a bronze disc darker than Bezu's, smaller, heavier in intent. He stepped closer and saw the spiral wave guide, incomplete. A deliberate gap where the groove should have been continuous, a safeguard, a breaker in the circuit, a 12th disc designed to fail if played. Footsteps found the crack's mouth, 2 silhouettes, shoulders angled like parentheses around him, a continuance pin, a severance pin. Both wore the faint, tired smile of people who had arrived by different roads at the same appointment. The vaults on the Ligurian coast met like the spokes of a wheel. Candlelight feathered the ribs. Outside, the sky sorted itself into Jupiter, Saturn, and Moon, the triple sign the disc had whispered for months. 12 pedestals, 11 discs, whole, polished, tuned. A 12th in Langla's hands, flawed by design. Continuance stood to the left, eyes bright with righteous math. Severance to the right, tense, quiet, holding a last option like a breath. Langla felt the cedar baton in his pocket, the Portolan bearings that had ferried him here, and the small iron wedge he'd cut into Vera, shaped to fill the spiral's gap. He laid the 12th disc onto its pedestal. Continuance moved with rehearsed economy, aligning, checking, nodding. Mallets, polished wood, were distributed, 1 to each custodian. On the 3rd bell, the continuance leader said. The tower's first chime rolled through the nave, deep, slow, anchoring. Across the line, the severance leader met Langla's eyes. The plea wasn't melodrama, it was arithmetic. 2nd bell. He slid his fingers toward his jacket, feeling the wedge's weight like a small, dangerous truth. The 3rd bell began to swing. The sound was a tide, 729 hertz, the pure, unwavering core, braided with neighbors, slightly lower, slightly higher, until the room stopped being air and became pressure. The candles leaned inward, the stones hummed, the nave thickened until you could have leaned your shoulder against nothing and been held. At the edges of sight, a shimmer, as if heat rose from winter stone. Outlines wavered, color bled, faces acquired second versions of themselves and then lost them. Time hiccuped, small but felt. The spiral on the flawed disc stared up at him, a circuit purposeful almost to the end. He could seat the wedge, complete the groove, turn the key fully, give continuance their clean correction. Or he could knock the disc from its stand, shatter the phase, end the cycle forever, and leave the world to its unedited fate. He thought of maps redrawn and names forgotten, not as tragedies, but as choices someone had made for everyone else. He thought of the cedar baton hidden 2 hand depths below a chapel tile, a decision by a long-dead custodian to leave a fuse uncapped. He thought of Sister Clemence's folder tied with red ribbon, and of the monk in Corsica who had said, "Leave it outside." He stepped forward. For a fraction too small to name, the world split. 2 futures ran alongside each other like rails, and in one of them he slid the iron into place with a surgeon's delicacy. In the other, his elbows swept, clumsy and absolute. Neither felt heroic. Both felt like obedience to different ghosts. Silence. Not absence of sound, absence with weight. The shimmer collapsed. Candles guttered, air thinned, and then returned like a tide that remembered itself. Morning entered through a broken rose window as if nothing had happened. The pedestals were bare. No discs, no mallets, no pins. No one spoke until speech felt possible again, and then the words had grown shy. Later, Langlois would notice small things. A Marseille alley that now ended in a square he didn't remember. Pleasant, ordinary, inexplicable. A history book on his shelf whose last chapter carried a paragraph he was certain he would have underlined had it been there before. A postcard from Bézu in a drawer that had always been blank, now bearing, faintly, a scribble he recognized as his own. He could not say which future had won, or whether futures were even the right word. He knew only that the clock which had begun its slow tick beneath an altar centuries ago had struck something, and that the silence afterward carried a new chord the city was learning to hum. If the Templars left a prophecy, it was not doom, it was a choice disguised as an object, carried by hands that knew they would never see the moment it argued with the sky. They did not bury treasure. They buried instructions and dared strangers to decide if they should be followed. In a folder in Avignon, a red ribbon sits tied over photographs of people who watched so others wouldn't have to. In a Corsican monastery, an iron bell waits for the next hand that needs to set something down. And in a small Marseille apartment, a brass astrolabe that belongs in a museum tilts on a nail, catching afternoon light and throwing an oval of brightness onto a wall where a date was once boxed in pencil. The line beneath it is deeper now, pressed hard enough to score plaster. The wheel doesn't care if we are ready, it turns all the same, but what we do while it turns, that part was always ours.